Helen Whitmore knelt in the garden of the house on Maple Avenue and wrapped both hands around the base of the climbing rose she had planted the spring after her wedding. The roots gripped deep, 47 years of growth, anchoring themselves into soil that knew her husband's footsteps, her children's laughter, the weight of every casserole carried to a grieving neighbor. She did not cry. She worked the trowel beneath the root ball with the same methodical patience she brought to pie crust and broken marriages and sons who could not meet her eyes. The clay yielded. She transferred the tangled mass into a ceramic pot, pressed damp earth around the exposed roots, and tied the longest cane to a bamboo stake with garden twine. Helen Whitmore did not abandon living things, not roses, not husbands, not grandchildren she had barely begun to know. But the house, the Victorian beauty with gingerbread trim, and a wraparound porch where neighborhood children once gathered for lemonade on summer afternoons, the house she had already lost. The moving truck sat in the driveway like a coffin on wheels. Walter had spent the morning in his wheelchair directing the movers with gestures because his voice kept failing him. He had restored every inch of this 1890 structure with his own hands across 4 decades, replaced porch railings, rebuilt the kitchen twice, sanded and refinished floors that had witnessed first steps and last arguments, and 100 Thanksgiving dinners where the turkey was always slightly overdone because Helen insisted on conversation over thermometers. Now strangers in company t-shirts carried his craftsmanship out the front door in bubble wrap and labeled boxes while he sat with a metal plate and 8 screws holding his right hip together and watched his life's work disappear into a truck bed. Inside, Helen moved through rooms that echoed with absence. The living room where Patrick's folded flag still occupied its place of honor on the mantel. She wrapped it last, pressing the triangular bundle against her chest for a moment before placing it in the box marked "Sacred" in her firm handwriting. Patrick, their middle child, the daredevil who had enlisted at 19 and died at 30 when his military transport was shot down over mountains half a world away. 10 years since the officers appeared at her door in dress uniforms. 10 years since she learned that a mother's worst fear has the sound the particular creak of a screen door opening at an hour when no one should be visiting. The kitchen counter held a stack of postcards bound with a rubber band, Claire's handwriting growing less frequent with each year. The most recent showed Waikiki Beach palm trees bent against trade winds. "Miss you, Mom. Wish you were here." Claire, their youngest, the artist who had married a military officer and followed him to Honolulu 5 years ago. The weekly video calls had stretched to monthly, then occasional holiday conversations that ended with promises of visits dissolving like sugar in rain. Each time Helen hung up the phone, the distance between Hawaii and the mainland felt less like geography and more like a decision someone had made without telling her. She found the teapot last. Her mother's porcelain teapot, hand-painted blue forget-me-nots circling the rim, a hairline crack along the spout that Helen had repaired with food-safe adhesive 20 years ago because some fractures deserve mending rather than discarding. She sat amid the bubble wrap and newspaper, cradling the piece in her lap. And the composure she had maintained through every stage of dismantling finally cracked along its own invisible fault line. Tears fell without sound. She did not wipe them away. Walter found her there. He eased down from his wheelchair to the floor beside her, despite the protest of surgical steel in his hip, lowering himself with a grimace he tried to hide and failed. His hand found hers on the teapot's curved handle. They had been married 49 years. Certain gestures no longer required translation. "We've had a good run in this old place. Made enough memories to last several lifetimes." Helen leaned against his shoulder, feeling the thinness that 6 weeks of hospital food and rehabilitation had carved into his frame. "I know it's just a house." His correction came gentle but firm. "It's not just a house. It's where we became who we are. But Helen, we take that with us wherever we go." She wanted to believe him. The alternative was admitting that everything solid beneath her feet had turned to sand, and Helen Whitmore was not a woman who stood on sand without building something. 6 months earlier, Walter had climbed onto the roof to fix a leak because stubborn pride and 40 years of self-sufficiency had blinded him to the simple mathematics of age and gravity. Why pay someone $300 for something I can do myself? The argument had come sharp and final, while Helen stood below, arms crossed, every instinct screaming that 75-year-old men with arthritic knees did not belong on pitched roofs in November rain. She had been right. The ladder shifted. Walter's boots found air instead of rung. The sound his body made hitting the flagstone walkway would live in her memory alongside the creak of the screen door when the officers came for Patrick, sounds that divided her life into before and after. Emergency surgery, a broken hip requiring a titanium plate and 8 screws. Weeks of rehabilitation where Walter, a man who had once carried oak beams across construction sites single-handed, needed assistance to reach the bathroom. The hospital bill arrived like a second injury, $45,000. Their Medicare covered barely half. The supplemental insurance policy had lapsed the previous month. When premium increases outpaced their fixed income by $60 a gap, Helen had intended to close with her November Social Security check, a plan that Walter's fall rendered permanently moot. They managed. They always managed. Helen canceled the cable subscription, switched to generic medications, rationed heating oil by wearing extra sweaters indoors. The numbers still refused to add up, but they might have survived on strict economy and stubborn will if the economy hadn't chosen that same winter to collapse around their son. Mitchell's custom furniture business had been his father's proudest legacy. Not the business itself, which Walter had no part in founding, but the skill behind it. The hands that carved dovetail joints and shaped walnut into art were Walter's hands, passed down through demonstration and patience across 20 years of Saturday workshops. When luxury spending evaporated overnight, Mitchell's order book emptied with it. The bank sent foreclosure notices on both his workshop and the family home in Oak Ridge Estates, where his wife and 2 small children slept beneath a roof suddenly worth less than the paper threatening to take it. Mitchell came to the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon in February, still wearing sawdust on his sleeves because he had driven straight from the workshop where he had been inventorying tools for possible liquidation. He sat beside his father's bed and could not meet his eyes. The kids might have to change schools. Vanessa's beside herself about it, says her friends will all know we failed. Helen watched her son from the visitor's chair, where she had spent most of the past 3 weeks. Mitchell, at 48, still carried himself like the responsible firstborn, who mowed lawns at 12 and held the family together at 20, when Patrick's death nearly unraveled them all. But responsibility without courage becomes its own kind of cowardice, and Helen saw in her son's averted gaze the shape of a man who had learned to bend rather than stand. She made the decision before the thought fully formed in her mind, the way she had always made decisions, with the certainty of someone who trusted her own calculations more than she trusted hope. We could sell the house. It's too big for just us anyway, especially with your father's mobility during recovery. Walter's face crumpled. 1 second of raw grief that rearranged every line and shadow before he pulled it back into composure, like a man gathering scattered papers in wind. Helen saw it. She catalogued the cost. She continued. Plants can be transplanted, and I can bake anywhere there's a table and decent light. 2 months later, the signatures dried on closing documents that converted 47 years of living into a number sufficient to eliminate medical debt and rescue Mitchell's mortgage from foreclosure. The furniture business would still struggle. Orders do not return simply because a roof remains overhead. But at least the children would not change schools, and Vanessa's friends would not know. Biscuit, their 10-year-old golden retriever, understood departure before any box was sealed. He followed them from room to room with the anxious vigilance of an animal who has learned that furniture disappearing means people disappear next. When the last room stood empty, he sat in the center of the living room floor, bewildered by echoes in a space that had always been filled with warmth and cooking smells, and the particular creaking of Walter's workshop saw on Saturday mornings. Walter leaned down from his wheelchair and scratched behind Biscuit's ears. "Come on, old boy. We're going on an adventure." The adventure led to the guest bedroom at the far end of the second-floor hallway in Mitchell and Vanessa's house in Oak Ridge Estates. 5 bedrooms, 3-car garage, a backyard large enough for a swimming pool and a play structure, and the kind of landscaping that required professional maintenance because the point was appearance, not love. By any objective measure, this house had space to spare. The guest room told a different story. A queen bed pressed against one wall left narrow pathways around a small dresser that could not accommodate 2 people's clothing. Their remaining possessions, the furniture and tools and quilting supplies that had survived the liquidation, filled the garage in labeled stacks with seasonal rotations permitted inside, as Vanessa described it, making their belongings sound like inventory rather than remnants of a life. The first evening carried the scent of effort. Vanessa had arranged a small dinner flowers on the table, candles lit. Helen's favorite lemon chicken, prepared from a recipe she must have found online because Helen had never shared it with her. "We're so grateful you're here. The children are absolutely thrilled to have their grandparents close by." The words arrived perfectly formed, the performance of a woman who understood that certain gestures must be witnessed before they can be withdrawn. Helen returned the smile, noting how it stopped at Vanessa's eyes the way winter light stops at a window without warming the room behind it. But the children were genuine. 5-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Oliver launched themselves at the guest room door each morning, like small projectiles of joy scrambling onto the bed for stories and cuddles before school. Oliver pressed his face against Walter's chest and asked if Grandpa would build him a birdhouse like the one at the old house. Lily pulled Helen's hand toward the kitchen, requesting cookies with faces the kind with raisin eyes and frosting smiles that required an hour of patient decorating for 3 minutes of delighted consumption. These moments deposited warmth into a bank account that Helen did not yet know she would need to draw on, interest compounding silently against the withdrawals to come. Within weeks, the temperature in the household shifted by degrees so small that each change seemed reasonable in isolation. Vanessa on the phone while chopping vegetables, voice-pitched for privacy, but carrying through the open kitchen window where Helen sat reading on the porch. "I never signed up to run a multi-generational household." Helen closed her book and said nothing, storing the data the way she stored everything carefully, without waste available for later assembly. The armchair Helen had brought from the old house, the overstuffed recliner, where she had nursed 3 children and read 10,000 bedtime stories, and sat with Walter through every crisis their marriage had weathered, appeared one afternoon in the basement. "We need the space for the new entertainment center." Vanessa's explanation arrived with the particular brightness of someone presenting unreasonable things in reasonable packaging. Walter's remaining woodworking tools, once organized in a garage corner, with the precision of a man who respected his instruments, were consolidated into cardboard boxes and stacked behind Christmas decorations. The children need space for their bikes. Oliver was 4. His bicycle had training wheels and occupied approximately 3 square feet. Meals became theaters of subtle demolition. "Walter, you're welcome to have seconds, of course. Though the nutritionist at my gym says men your age should really reduce portions to match decreased metabolism." Or the dairy campaign launched without warning on a Tuesday morning. "Helen, I've switched us all to almond milk. I read that regular dairy can accelerate memory issues in seniors. You can never start prevention too early." The statements arrived wrapped in concern, like barbed wire wrapped in silk. Touch it and you bleed. But from a distance, it almost looks like decoration. Mitchell witnessed each exchange from behind his coffee cup, his newspaper, his increasingly elaborate excuses to be elsewhere. Once he attempted intervention voice, uncertain as a man testing thin ice with one foot. "Viv, I don't think my parents need dietary advice from your gym buddies." The response came swift and practiced, a weapon kept sharp by regular use. "I'm only thinking of their health. Don't you want them to be healthy?" The question permitted no answer that did not concede the ground. Mitchell retreated. He always retreated. Helen watched her son choose the path of least resistance, with the same grim recognition a surgeon brings to identifying disease, seeing clearly what cannot yet be treated. One evening after the children were asleep and Mitchell was working late, Helen passed the master bedroom on her way back from the bathroom. The door was cracked. Through the gap, she saw Vanessa sitting on the edge of the bathtub, phone pressed to her ear, and for the first time the mask was entirely absent. No performance, no brightness. Vanessa's free hand trembled against her knee and her voice carried the ragged edge of genuine exhaustion. "I can't breathe in my own house, Mom. They're everywhere. I get up and they're in the kitchen. I come home and they're in the living room. I love Mitchell, but I didn't marry his parents." Whatever her mother said in response straightened Vanessa's spine like a rod being inserted. The trembling stopped, the jaw set. "Then do what you have to do." Helen moved past the door without sound. She did not feel sympathy, exactly the word was too gentle for what Vanessa was becoming. But she recognized something in that bathroom moment. Pressure without outlet becomes cruelty. Vanessa was not evil. She was cornered, and cornered people bite whatever is nearest. Understanding did not make the teeth less sharp. The activities began multiplying on the family calendar with strategic precision. Lily has ballet on Tuesdays now, then piano on Thursdays. Oliver started soccer that conflicted perfectly with the after-school hours Helen and Walter treasured most. Each announcement chipped away at the time they spent with their grandchildren until nearly every afternoon was scheduled every evening, committed every weekend filled with events that somehow never required grandparents. Helen tracked the pattern the way she had once tracked household budgets, with ruthless accuracy and growing alarm. More concerning were the changes she noticed in Walter. Her husband's confidence had eroded like riverbank in spring flood, so gradually that the cumulative loss only became visible when she looked for the original shape. He apologized constantly for using the bathroom, for pouring coffee, for existing in common spaces. He second-guessed movements he had performed unconsciously for decades, pausing at doorways to listen for Vanessa's location before committing to entering a room. Helen caught herself doing the same. She whispered even when Vanessa was not home, as if her voice itself might constitute trespass. The realization sickened her. They had become ghosts in a house they had paid for with everything they owned. 3 months after their arrival, Walter woke at 3 in the morning, needing the bathroom. Still uncertain with his healing hip in darkness, he moved cautiously through the unfamiliar room. His slipper caught on a decorative throw rug that Vanessa had placed beside their bed, a rug that had not been there when they went to sleep, its tasseled edge invisible in the dark. He crashed against the bathroom door frame with a sound that brought the household erupting upward through layers of sleep. Lights slashed on. Mitchell appeared in the hallway, pajama shirt buttoned wrong, reaching for his father. The children's faces appeared at their doorways, like pale moon's eyes wide with the particular terror children reserve for sounds that adults make when hurt. Vanessa emerged last. Her hair fell in perfect arrangement, despite the hour suggesting either remarkable genes or recent attention to a mirror. Her lips compressed into a bloodless line that Helen recognized as the expression Vanessa wore when building a case. Mitchell helped Walter to his feet. "Dad just tripped, Viv. It could happen to anyone." The defense arrived weak and preliminary, a plea rather than a statement. Vanessa's response carried the devastating patience of someone who has been waiting for evidence. "This is exactly what I was worried about." She turned toward the stairs, adding over her shoulder with the casual authority of a verdict already decided. "We'll discuss this in the morning." The discussion never materialized in its promised form. Instead, by afternoon, Vanessa had scheduled a home assessment with a company specializing in senior modifications. The evaluator, a young man barely into his 30s with a clipboard and the earnest confidence of someone who has studied aging, without experiencing it, walked through the house, making recommendations that systematically restricted Helen and Walter's movements rather than adapting spaces to accommodate them. We could restrict nighttime bathroom visits with an evening fluid management plan. The words floated in the living room air, while Walter sat rigid in a kitchen chair, jaw locked against humiliation. Vanessa added her contribution with the tone of someone discussing carpet samples. Or perhaps adult undergarments would be appropriate for nighttime. That evening, Walter sat on the edge of their bed, his shoulders curved inward, vertebrae visible through his shirt. A posture Helen had never seen on the man who had once carried her across the threshold of their Maple Avenue house, with a strength that seemed inexhaustible. I never thought I'd become a burden to my own son. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has just discovered the limits of his usefulness and found them closer than expected. Helen placed her hand on his arm, not gently, but with pressure, with intention, the grip of a woman who is also gripping the edges of her own composure. You are not a burden. You raised that boy, put him through college, helped with the down payment on his first house. If anyone has the right to occupy space in his life, it's you. She believed every word. She also lay awake that night after Walter's breathing deepened into sleep, staring at the ceiling of a room that was not hers, in a house she had purchased with her life savings, and aloud the question she had been refusing to form. Had she been wrong to suggest selling? If they still owned the Maple Avenue house, still controlled their assets, would Vanessa dare treat them this way? Probably not. The selling had not just eliminated their debt, it had eliminated their leverage. A mother who gives everything becomes a dependent, and dependents survive at the pleasure of those who house them. Helen understood this with the particular clarity that arrives at 2 in the morning, when all comforting illusions have retired for the night. She had made the right decision for the wrong reason, or the wrong decision for the right reason, or perhaps both simultaneously, which is how most irreversible choices work when you examine them honestly enough. She would do it again. She would sell that house 100 times to save Mitchell's children from the destabilization of foreclosure. That certainty was the floor beneath her feet, and also the trapdoor. The small memory lapses that accumulate naturally at 72, forgetting a watered plant, and watering it again, leaving a stove burner on for 3 extra minutes, while rushing to bandage Oliver's scraped knee, became evidence in an argument Helen did not know was being constructed against her. Vanessa catalogued each incident with prosecutorial thoroughness, building a narrative from ordinary moments, the way someone might build a house from stolen bricks. These episodes are happening more frequently. First the stove, now the plants. It's concerning, isn't it? The stove incident had lasted 90 seconds and ended with no damage. In Vanessa's retelling, it became a near catastrophe, narrowly averted, a harbinger of decline, proof that the machinery of Helen's mind was developing cracks that would eventually split open. Walter noticed the exaggerations but found himself unequipped to counter them. Each time he attempted to defend Helen, Vanessa deployed the same disarming technique: agreement delivered as dismissal. I understand you want to protect her. That's admirable. But denial doesn't help anyone, especially with conditions that can progress rapidly at her age. The word conditions performed heavy labor in these conversations, transforming normal aging into pathology, converting a forgotten plant into a diagnosis. One Saturday afternoon, Mitchell sat alone in the basement workshop, the space Vanessa had designated as his and his alone, a gift that was also a boundary. His father's graduation gift rested across his knees, a set of chisels with rosewood handles that Walter had selected one by one from a specialty catalog, each blade a different width, the leather roll that held them softened by decades of oil and use. Mitchell ran his thumb along the edge of the widest blade. He knew what was happening upstairs. He knew the dietary comments were cruelty dressed as concern. He knew the scheduled activities were designed to isolate rather than enrich. He knew because he was not stupid, only afraid. The last time he had challenged Vanessa on anything substantive, the house had frozen for 11 days. Not arguments, not slammed doors. Worse, silence. Meals served without eye contact. The children handled with exaggerated tenderness that excluded him, as if he were the danger from which they needed protecting. On the ninth day, the careful suggestion. Maybe the kids and I should spend some time at my mother's, just until things settle down. The threat wore casual clothing, but its bones were steel. Mitchell had backed down. He had always backed down. He gripped the chisel until his knuckles whitened, because the alternative was admitting that his silence was not diplomacy, but cowardice, and cowardice compounds daily into something that eventually cannot be repaid. Lily asked the question at dinner on a Thursday in April, between bites of chicken and broccoli, with the devastating clarity that only children possess because they have not yet learned which truths require concealment. "Mummy, why do you make that face when Grandma hugs me?" Vanessa's fork paused midair. Her smile arrived one beat too late, its edges manufactured rather than organic. "What face, sweetheart? I don't make any face." Oliver, who at 4 already demonstrated the Whitmore inability to leave well enough alone, supplied the supporting testimony. "Yes, you do, like when I eat broccoli and pretend I like it." The table fell into a silence that felt architectural, as if someone had removed a load-bearing wall, and everyone was waiting for the ceiling to decide whether to hold. Mitchell forced a laugh that convinced no one, least of all himself. "Kids say the darndest things, right?" But the observation hung in the air with the permanence of something that has been seen and cannot be unseen. Children see truth because they have not yet been taught the courtesy of pretending otherwise. 5 months into the arrangement, on a hot Sunday in June, Helen stood at the kitchen counter slicing strawberries for a fruit tray while the household occupied the backyard in a rare shared activity. Through the open window, Mitchell's voice reached her first, weary and defensive, answering a question she had not heard. "What do you want me to do? They sold their house to save ours. They have nowhere else to go." Vanessa's response arrived with the precision of prepared remarks. That was their choice. Helen's knife stopped. "You don't think watching your son lose his home is force enough?" The blade hovered over a half-cut berry. "All I'm saying is that there are options for people their age. Communities designed for seniors, places with appropriate care levels." Mitchell's resistance was predictable in both its presence and its inadequacy. "We can't afford assisted living, Viv. Their social security barely covers medications." Vanessa had anticipated this. "Government programs, Medicaid." Mitchell pressed. "They'd have to be destitute to qualify. Is that what you want, for my parents to have nothing?" The word nothing landed in Helen's chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Of course not. I'm thinking of everyone's well-being. The children need space to grow. We need our privacy back, and your parents need proper care from professionals." Helen placed the knife on the counter with deliberate care because her hands had begun to tremble, and she would not permit them that indulgence. The conversation confirmed what observation had suggested, but hope had refused to assemble in Vanessa's calculation. They were unwelcome variables in a domestic equation, items with an expiration date that had already passed. That evening she relayed every word to Walter as they prepared for bed. He listened with the stillness of a man absorbing impact. "She wants us gone, and Mitchell isn't exactly fighting to keep us." Walter's sigh carried the weight of a man revising his understanding of his own son. "Maybe she's right, not about sending us away, but about us being a burden here. This arrangement isn't working for anyone. Mitchell's caught in the middle. The kids are confused by the tension, and we're walking on eggshells in what's supposed to be our home, too." Helen held his gaze. "What alternatives do we have? Our savings went to medical bills and helping Mitchell. Our house is gone. We are too old for mortgages and job applications." Walter had no answer. Neither did Helen. But she was already building one, testing its supports in the private workshop of her mind, not yet ready to share the blueprints. 1 week later, precisely 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, Helen, startled from troubled sleep, pulled upward by voices threading through the old heating vent near the floor. The same vent that in winter carried warmth, and in all seasons carried sound from the kitchen directly below. Vanessa was speaking with the fluency of someone presenting a prepared case. I've already looked into Sunset Manor. It's perfect for their needs. Helen's hand found Walter's shoulder. He surfaced from sleep, blinking confused, until her finger pressed against his lips and pointed toward the floor. Understanding assembled in his eyes. 4,200 a month. Vanessa's voice carried the crisp satisfaction of someone who has done research. Their Medicare won't cover half. But here's the thing. Once they're declared incompetent to manage their finances, we become their legal guardians. Walter's hand found Helen's in the darkness. His grip tightened until she felt bone against bone. Mitchell's voice sounded uncertain, a man being led into territory he had not agreed to explore. Declared incompetent on what grounds? Vanessa's answer revealed months of invisible preparation. Dr. Martinez already said Walter's depression after the fall, combined with Helen's memory issues, should be enough. He's sympathetic to our situation. The word sympathetic performed a particular violence, converting their family physician into a co-conspirator. You've discussed my parents with our doctor without telling me. The question carried genuine shock, not at the action itself, Helen noted, but at having been excluded from it. Someone had to take initiative. The rebuke arrived with impatience that suggested Vanessa viewed Mitchell's surprise as further evidence of the weakness she was compensating for. Look, once guardianship is established, their monthly social security, Walter's pension, the insurance payout from their house, it all comes to us to manage their care. The mathematics of betrayal assembled themselves in Helen's mind. With the same precision she brought to baking ratios and measurements that could not be argued with, only measured against. Everything they had surrendered to save this family was now being catalogued as revenue in someone else's business plan. Mitchell's resistance arrived predictably inadequate. They gave us everything to save our house. Vanessa's response stripped the sentiment to its transactional bones. Exactly. And look where it got us, stuck with them 24/7. Walter can barely walk, Helen's losing her mind. And I can't even have friends over because they're always here. The kids need their own space to grow. Mitchell tried once more, reaching for the only defense he could locate. But Lily loves her bedtime stories. The objection was so small against the magnitude of what was being planned that Helen felt something shift permanently inside her. Not anger, which had been building for months, but the cold clarity that arrives when you finally understand exactly where you stand and how few people are standing with you. Vanessa's voice sharpened into the tone of a woman who has exhausted her patience for weakness. Grow a backbone. Your daughter will adapt. Kids are resilient. But I won't spend my prime years as a nursemaid to your parents. I've already spoken to a lawyer about the competency hearing. Silence from below. Helen and Walter remained motionless in their bed, hands locked together so tightly that sensation began to fade at the fingertips. When were you planning to tell me about this? Mitchell asked. I'm telling you now. The appointment is Tuesday. The lawyer says the process can move quickly with medical support. Mitchell's last stand was a question rather than a statement, which told Helen everything she needed to know about its structural integrity. What about my parents' wishes? Don't they deserve a say in their own lives? Vanessa answered with the calm authority of someone who has already won. That's the point of the competency hearing, to establish they're no longer capable of making sound decisions. Look at the evidence. Walter's depression, Helen's memory lapses, the medication confusion. Dr. Martinez has documented everything. Mitchell's voice cracked on the word documented. You've been building a case against my parents. The correction came smooth as a closing argument. I've been documenting legitimate concerns for their safety and ours. The hearing date will be set this week. The voices below faded as chairs scraped and footsteps moved toward the stairs. Helen and Walter lay in darkness so complete it seemed physical pressing against them from all sides. Minutes accumulated before either risked speech. Walter's whisper carried the shock of a man who has just learned that the ground beneath his home is not solid but hollow. She's planning to have us declared incompetent. Helen completed the architecture. To take control of everything we have left, not just institutional care, financial exploitation, elder abuse. The words sounded clinical legal belonging to newspaper articles about strangers. They did not sound like something that could happen to a woman who had raised 3 children, managed a household for half a century, and baked 11,000 loaves of bread by honest count. But they were happening. The evidence had been assembling for months beneath her feet like groundwater, and she had felt the dampness without tracing it to its source. Maybe Mitchell will stand up to her. Walter's hope was reflexive rather than genuine. Helen measured it against 5 months of evidence. His strongest objection was about bedtime stories. The sentence settled between them with the finality of a coffin lid. At 3 in the morning, while Walter slept the fitful sleep of a man whose body enforces rest even when his mind refuses it, Helen stood in the narrow bathroom and faced the mirror. The woman reflected back was 72 silver-haired face lined by fatigue and months of accumulated vigilance. She asked herself the question directly without evasion, the way she would ask a doctor for a diagnosis she suspected but needed confirmed. Am I being dramatic? If I talk to Mitchell alone in the daylight without Vanessa's presence shaping his responses, will he protect us? She turned the possibility over. She tested its weight. She remembered Mitchell's voice through the vent, not outraged, not defiant, but uncertain. The voice of a man who had already decided to comply and was only negotiating the terms of his surrender. No, Mitchell would not save them. Mitchell could not save himself. Helen returned to bed. She placed her hand on Walter's shoulder and applied pressure until his eyes opened. She spoke with a calm that frightened her, because it came not from courage, but from the absolute elimination of alternatives. We leave in 3 days. I have a plan. Walter blinked. Sleep and shock competed for control of his expression. Leave, where would we go with what? Anywhere but here, with whatever we can carry. The words arrived with the force of something that has been building for months and has finally found its exit. I would rather sleep on a bus station bench than let that woman sign papers declaring that my mind doesn't work. I've been baking since 4 this morning and running this household's budget for 50 years and raised 3 children into adulthood. And I will not sit in a courtroom while a lawyer I've never met tells a judge I can't manage my own life. Walter studied her face in the darkness. Whatever he found there, determination, terror. The particular steel that had carried their family through Patrick's death and Claire's departure, and his own broken body, he recognized it as something beyond argument. 3 days. Helen nodded. 3 days to convert 50 years of life into 2 suitcases. 3 days to say goodbye to grandchildren without saying goodbye. 3 days to plan an escape at an age when most people are planning nothing more dramatic than tomorrow's breakfast. She did not sleep again that night. She lay beside her husband and built a plan from the only materials available: limited cash, limited time, unlimited refusal to surrender. Outside the window, the neighborhood slept beneath street lamps that cast pools of orange light onto lawns maintained to standards that had nothing to do with love. Somewhere in the house below, Vanessa slept the sleep of a woman whose plans were proceeding on schedule. And in the guest room that had never been more than a holding cell with floral wallpaper, Helen Whitmore began her preparations for war. The 3 days that followed moved in twin currents. The visible life of routine and the invisible life of preparation running beneath it like groundwater, beneath a familiar street. Helen maintained every surface pattern. She attended her quilting group on Tuesday afternoon, walked biscuit at the usual hours, prepared meals when the kitchen was unoccupied, and spoke to Vanessa with the same careful neutrality she had perfected over 5 months of cohabitation. Nothing in her behavior suggested departure. Everything in her behavior served it. Tuesday morning, the quilting circle met at the senior center on Birch Street. Helen arrived carrying her project bag and a small velvet pouch she had retrieved from the bottom of her suitcase at 4 in the morning, while Walter slept. Inside the pouch, her mother's pearl earrings worn at her own wedding and every anniversary since, and a gold bracelet Walter had given her for their 25th. She had calculated their approximate value during a sleepless pre-dawn hour, consulting memory rather than the internet, because search histories leave trails, and Helen was building an escape, not a breadcrumb path. Margaret Ainsley, a fellow quilter whose son ran a jewelry shop on 3rd Avenue, had mentioned once that her boy bought estate pieces for fair prices. Helen waited until the group broke for coffee, then approached Margaret with the velvet pouch, and an explanation so casual it bordered on artistry. Downsizing further. Too many things collecting dust. The boy 35. Balding early with the appraiser's habit of examining objects without revealing his assessment. Offered $847 for both pieces. Helen accepted without negotiation. Haggling would have drawn attention, and attention was a currency she could not afford to spend. She tucked the cash into the interior pocket of her quilting bag beside the fabric scissors and walked back to the senior center, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Her fingers found the empty space on her left wrist, where the bracelet had lived for 24 years. The absence had weight. She carried it. That afternoon, she used the senior center's public computer terminal. Not the household Wi-Fi, not her phone, connected to Mitchell's family plan to research overnight bus routes heading east. She studied fare tables, departure times, and connection points with the concentration she once reserved for tax returns and mortgage applications. The Greyhound schedule offered a 1:15 departure that would clear them from the metropolitan area before dawn. She memorized the route number and fare without writing anything down. Paper can be found, memory cannot be searched. Walter handled his assignment with equal discipline. Wednesday morning at the public library where he volunteered teaching basic woodworking to children. He withdrew his modest stipend from a separate savings account that Vanessa had never learned about because Walter had opened it before their move and funded it with small cash payments from grateful parents whose children he taught to sand and shape pine into birdhouses. $312. He told the librarian, a kind woman named John, who had become something close to a friend during his months of volunteering, that he might be traveling soon. Jean did not press for details. People who work in libraries understand that some stories are checked out, but never returned. Wednesday evening, Helen inventoried their medications on a notepad she would later tear into small pieces and flush. Walter's blood pressure pills, 10 days remaining. Her arthritis medication, 14 days. His antidepressant prescribed after the fall, and the subsequent erosion of everything that had made him feel like a man rather than a patient. 22 days, the newest prescription, and therefore the fullest bottle. She calculated refill logistics in unfamiliar locations, costs without insurance, the window of time between departure and destitution in pharmaceutical terms. The numbers were not encouraging. She added them to the plan anyway, because a plan with difficult numbers is still a plan, and no plan at all is just waiting for someone else to decide your future. The preparations for the grandchildren took place on the 3rd day and cost more than jewelry or savings accounts, extracting payment in a currency that has no exchange rate and no refund policy. Walter sat in the narrow space between the bed and the wall, working by the light of a desk lamp, angled to avoid casting shadows visible from the hallway. The wooden bird took shape under his hands, a Cardinal Oliver's favorite with individual feather details, carved so fine they caught light like the real thing. His hands trembled from the precision work, and from something that had nothing to do with his hands. Each cut was a sentence in a letter he could not write. Each sanded curve an apology for an absence the boy was too young to understand. Helen baked in the early morning hours when the kitchen belonged to no one. Lily's favorite cookies, the ones with raisin eyes and frosting smiles that the girl called happy faces, filled a tin she had purchased at the dollar store and decorated with stickers from Oliver's craft drawer. Inside the lid, she taped a handwritten recipe card in her clearest script. Grandma Helen's special smiling cookies. Now you can make them yourself, my brave girl. The words blurred twice while she wrote them. She blinked the blur away and continued because the recipe needed to be legible, and grief is not an acceptable excuse for poor penmanship. They wrote letters, not explanations. The children were too young for the truth and too smart for comfortable lies, but permission slips for love. Grandma and Grandpa are going on an adventure. We love you bigger than the whole sky, and we will talk to you as soon as we can. Be brave, be kind, take care of Mommy and Daddy. The words were inadequate, the way all words are inadequate when they must substitute for presence. But they were the best available alternative to silence. Total resources assembled across 3 days of covert preparation. $847 from jewelry, $312 from Walter's library account, and a small emergency reserve Helen had maintained in a coffee can at the bottom of her sewing kit. Cash from odd jobs returned grocery coupons. Small economies practiced with the discipline of a woman raised during the generation that remembered its grandparents' depression stories. Combined total approximately $1,160. Enough for 2 to 3 weeks of bare survival. Not enough for anything resembling a future. Helen accepted the math and added it to the plan because the alternative, remaining complying, surrendering to a courtroom judgment that would reduce her to a legal dependent of the woman who had orchestrated the entire proceeding, was not something she could attach a dollar value to. Dignity has no price because it cannot be purchased, only lost or defended. The third night arrived with the particular stillness of a house that does not know it is about to lose 2 of its occupants. 11:30. Helen lay fully dressed beneath the covers. Shoes placed beside the bed with laces already loosened for quick entry. Walter breathed beside her, equally awake, equally dressed. The shared pretense of sleep and offering to whatever surveillance the house might contain. At precisely 11:30, Helen touched his hand once, the signal they had agreed upon, and rose. They moved through the practice choreography of departure. 2 small suitcases packed that afternoon, while Vanessa attended a school fundraiser meeting. Clothing for a week, medications in Ziploc bags, labeled with dosage schedules, photocopies of identification documents, and insurance cards. Patrick's military photograph in its silver frame, Claire's childhood drawing of a family holding hands beneath an improbably large sun, a thumb drive containing every digitized family photograph Helen had spent 2 evenings transferring from her laptop. The laptop itself stayed behind. It could be tracked. The hallway navigation required the precision of a surgical procedure. Helen led weight distributed to avoid the 3rd floorboard from the bathroom, the one that announced pressure with a groan audible 2 rooms away. Walter followed his hip, registering each step as a negotiation between willpower and hardware. Biscuit padded beside them, on silent pause, leash already attached his arthritic gait, almost soundless on the carpeted runner. They paused at each grandchild's doorway. Walter placed the carved cardinal on Oliver's windowsill, positioning it to catch the first morning light, so the boy would see it upon waking, and know before understanding could form words that someone who loved him had been there in the night. Helen set the cookie tin on Lily's bedside table next to the stuffed rabbit the girl slept with and tucked the letter beneath the lid, where small fingers would discover it. Lily's face in sleep held the absolute peace of a child who has not yet learned that people who love you can disappear between sunset and sunrise. Helen allowed herself 3 seconds of looking. Then she turned and did not look back, because looking back is how escape fails. Down the stairs in stocking feet, suitcases carried between them, weight-distributed handles gripped to prevent the metallic click of extending telescoping poles. Through the kitchen, where Helen placed the house key on the counter. A deliberate gesture, a relinquishment formalized in brass and silence. Through the side door eased open with practiced slowness, eased closed without the latch engaging. Because the latch mechanism had a distinctive snap that Helen had identified and catalogued during her months of learning, which sounds this house made, and which could betray her. The June night received them with warm air scented by the neighbor's jasmine, a smell that would forever after carry the taste of adrenaline, an irreversible choice. 3 blocks. 6 blocks to the bus stop. Helen had walked the route 3 times during daylight hours, measuring distance against Walter's pace, timing the gaps between streetlights, noting which houses had motion sensor floods and which slept dark. 3 blocks. Walter's hip seized at the end of the 3rd block. Not the gradual ache of exertion, but a sudden, complete refusal, the titanium plate and surrounding muscle entering into a disagreement that locked his right leg at an angle that prevented forward motion. He sank onto the front steps of a stranger's house, face gray beneath the street lamp's amber wash, sweat beading along his hairline despite the warm night. His breath came in shallow pulls that suggested pain beyond what speech could accommodate. Biscuit pressed against his leg, whimpering softly at the change in his person's chemistry that dogs detect before any medical instrument. Helen stood on the sidewalk between the suitcases and faced the geography of her decision. Behind her 3 blocks, a side door left unlatched. A bed still warm from their bodies, medications in full supply, a doctor who knew their history. Grandchildren who would wake in hours to find gifts and absence in equal measure. Ahead, 3 more blocks to a bus stop. A night journey to nowhere, specific insufficient funds, no medical support, and a husband whose body was actively arguing against the entire enterprise. She could go back. The thought arrived fully formed, practical, almost reasonable. Slip through the side door, return the key to her pocket guide. Walter upstairs removed the carved bird and cookie tin before the children woke and resumed the performance of compliance. Vanessa's plan would proceed. The hearing would be scheduled. Their autonomy would be adjudicated by strangers in a courtroom. But they would be warm. They would be medicated. They would be alive, which is not nothing when you are standing on a dark sidewalk watching your husband's face turn the color of ash. Then the inventory of what warmth would cost assembled itself against her will. Walter in adult undergarments because a woman 45 years younger had decided his bladder was a household inconvenience. Helen's name on a legal document declaring her incompetent to manage finances. She had managed flawlessly for 5 decades. Their social security rerouted into accounts controlled by Vanessa. Visits from grandchildren supervised and scheduled, and eventually reduced to holidays, then birthdays, then nothing at all. Because institutions are designed for efficiency, not for love, and love without access is just memory with no new material. Helen knelt beside Walter on the stranger's steps. She opened the suitcase, retrieved his medication pouch, found the pain tablet by touch, and placed it on his tongue with the efficiency of a woman who has administered pills to this man through surgeries and illnesses, and the kind of ordinary Wednesday evenings when a headache arrives without dramatic cause. She held the water bottle to his lips. She waited. When the tightness around his eyes eased by 1 degree, not gone but retreating, she took the rolling suitcase and positioned it beside him as a support, its extended handle at the right height for a man who needed something between a cane and a prayer. 3 more blocks, one at a time. I count the steps and you follow. They covered the remaining distance in 40 minutes. The math of that pace, approximately 1 block per 13 minutes each block, perhaps 300 feet, meaning forward progress of roughly 23 feet per minute, would have been absurd under any circumstances not defined by desperate necessity. Helen counted steps under her breath, not for Walter's benefit, but for her own, because counting imposed order on a situation that was threatening to dissolve into chaos, and order was the only weapon she had ever trusted completely. The bus stop bench received them like a judgment. Wooden slats, a faded schedule in a cracked plastic case, an advertisement for a personal injury lawyer grinning beneath a phone number that promised results. Walter leaned back and let the night air cool the sweat that had soaked through his shirt. Biscuit settled at their feet with the weary resignation of an old dog who has accepted that his people have lost their minds but remains committed to the partnership regardless. "We're homeless Helen, 75 and 72, sitting on a bench at midnight with a suitcase and a dog." Her hand found his. "We're not homeless, we're houseless. There's a difference. Home is wherever we make our own decisions." The bus arrived at 1 in the morning, doors hissing open to reveal a driver whose exhaustion matched the hour. His gaze swept across the elderly couple with luggage and a golden retriever, with the practiced disinterest of a man who has learned that midnight passengers carry stories he is not paid to hear. The dog drew his attention. No pets unless they're service animals. Walter straightened on the bench, drawing from some reserve of authority that his hip had not managed to drain. "He's my emotional support animal." The driver considered this claim against the evidence of a well-groomed retriever with a collar tag and gentle eyes. The cost-benefit analysis of confrontation versus schedule adherence resolved itself in 3 seconds. "Keep him under control." They settled near the back. Biscuit curled beneath the seat. Helen watched the Oak Ridge Estates neighborhood slide past the window. The houses growing smaller, the streetlights thinning the manicured landscapes, giving way to commercial strips, and then to the undifferentiated darkness between suburbs and downtown. The bus carried them away from everything familiar with the indifference of public transit, which does not distinguish between commuters and refugees, and charges the same fare for both. The downtown terminal at 2 in the morning was a place designed for neither comfort nor cruelty, but achieving both through neglect. Fluorescent tubes cast everything in the particular yellow that makes healthy skin look jaundiced and tired. Skin look terminal. Plastic seats in bolted rows held a sparse population of overnight travelers, each occupying the maximum space available, as if proximity to strangers might be contagious. Security guards patrolled with the even-handed suspicion of people paid to treat everyone as a potential problem. Helen located seats in a corner and inventoried their situation with the precision of a field commander assessing resources after a retreat. $1,160. Medications for 10 to 22 days depending on the prescription. 2 suitcases. 1 elderly dog. 1 husband whose hip had nearly ended their escape 3 blocks from origin. No destination. No contacts. No safety net of any description. A security guard informed them at 2:45 that the terminal would close to non-ticketed occupants at 3 and reopen at 5. Helen did not argue. She gathered their things and asked the guard, with the dignity of a woman, requesting directions rather than mercy, whether there was anywhere nearby open through the night. The guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s, whose eyes held the particular empathy of someone who has seen this question before and does not enjoy the asking, directed them to a diner 3 blocks east. The owner doesn't mind if people sit a while. The all-night diner occupied a corner lot beneath a sign that read Sonny's in letters that had once been neon and were now merely painted. Clean but worn, cracked vinyl booths a counter where solitary figures hunched over cups that had been refilled past the point of flavor. Helen chose a booth near the back-positioned luggage against the wall and guided Biscuit beneath the table, where his golden bulk became invisible to casual inspection. They ordered coffee, the cheapest item, the universal ticket to temporary tenancy in establishments that operate on the understanding that not everyone who sits down has come to eat. The man entered around 4 in the morning, filling the doorway with a frame that suggested decades of physical labor maintained into late middle age. Gray hair cropped military short, posture that belonged to someone who had spent formative years being told that slouching was a character defect. Perhaps late 60s, dressed in flannel and worn jeans, carrying a paper road map instead of consulting a phone, a detail that caught Walter's attention across the diner, because it marked a fellow citizen of an analog world, increasingly governed by screens. The waitress poured his coffee without waiting for the order, greeting him by name. Ray. He unfolded his map across the counter, and studied it with the concentration of a man plotting a course he has driven many times but never quite resolved. After 20 minutes and a plate of eggs dispatched with mechanical efficiency, he detoured to their booth instead of the exit. Up close, his face told stories in topography, deep creases around eyes the color of northern lakes, a scar bisecting one eyebrow with the precision of something earned rather than accidental, an expression calibrated to waste no energy on unnecessary pleasantries. "You folks look like you could use a hand." Walter's spine stiffened with the autonomic pride of a man who has spent 75 years refusing help. "We're fine, thank you." The stranger's assessment was direct absent pity, carrying instead the practical inventory of someone accustomed to evaluating situations without sentiment. "You don't look fine. You look like two people who've hit rough ground and could use a ride somewhere that isn't here." He extended a hand with the formality of someone for whom introductions still carry contractual weight. "Ray Kowalski, Vietnam 71 through 73, Purple Heart. Currently drive trucks and try to mind my own business, though I'm clearly failing at that last part tonight." Walter did not take the hand immediately. Helen did. Her grip matched his firm, brief communicating assessment rather than warmth. "Helen Whitmore. This is my husband, Walter. Where are you headed, Ray?" "Milbrook, about 4 hours east. Small town, nothing special, but it's quiet and the cost of living won't kill you." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, the mask of casual generosity slipping to reveal a more complicated architecture beneath. "Truthfully, I've been sitting at that counter for 2 hours trying to avoid going home. Got a decision to make about my mother that I keep putting off, and empty highway is better than an empty house when you're dodging something." The honesty disarmed Walter's resistance more effectively than kindness alone could have. A man admitting weakness to strangers is either dangerous or genuine, and Helen's instinct, honed by 72 years of reading people the way Walter Reed Woodgrain, selected genuine. "What's in Milbrook?" Helen pressed, because gratitude without information is just dependency wearing a polite expression. "Not much. Population 847. Young people leave and don't come back. Storefronts closing. But there's a pharmacy, a motel that's reasonable, and people who notice when someone's missing." He checked his watch. "I'm leaving in 15 minutes. The offer includes the dog." Walter's objection came reflexive and expected. "We don't know anything about you." Helen cut through it with the efficiency of a woman who has calculated the alternatives and found them shorter than 15 minutes. "We don't know anything about anywhere right now. A free ride saves bus fare and buys us time. And Ray isn't offering charity, he just told us he needs the company." She held Walter's gaze until his resistance folded. "Sometimes pride is a luxury we can't afford, Walter." 15 minutes later, their luggage occupied the extended cab of a well-maintained pickup truck, and Biscuit had claimed the back seat with the confidence of a dog who has decided that this vehicle at least meets his standards. Ray produced a blanket from behind the seat. For the dog, it's seen worse than golden retriever fur. Dawn found them east of the city, the compressed density of suburbs giving way to the longer rhythms of farmland and forest. Ray drove with the relaxed attention of a man who has covered more highway miles than he could calculate, hands easy on the wheel, eyes reading the road, the way experienced sailors read water. Conversation came in the unhurried patterns of people who have agreed to share space without obligation. Ray's story assembled itself in fragments offered without self-pity. Margaret, his wife, dead 8 years from breast cancer. No children, a fact he mentioned with the particular brevity that signals wounds still unhealed. His mother, Ella, 89, living in a small house in Milbrook he had bought for her years ago. Alone most weeks while he ran long-haul routes checked on by neighbors and a girl he paid to clean and stock the refrigerator. The dementia advancing by increments, a stove left burning, a walk in nightclothes at 3 in the morning that ended with a neighbor's phone call, names dissolving like sugar in water yesterday, indistinguishable from decades ago. He had reserved a room at Sunny Pines Assisted Living. The move was scheduled for tomorrow. Helen listened to the facts and the silences between them. Hearing in Ray's account the echo of her own situation inverted a son's wife pushing parents toward institutional care, a son pushing his mother toward the same destination from a different direction, but with the same result. She did not lecture. She did not draw parallels. She asked one question timed to the mile marker, when Ray's grip on the wheel had tightened visibly. If your mother could choose for herself, what would she want? Ray did not answer. The truck covered 2 miles in silence. Then he changed the subject to road conditions and weather forecasts, and Helen let him, because she had planted the question where it needed to grow, and pressing would only damage the roots. They stopped for lunch at a roadside diner in a town too small for a traffic light. The proprietor, a woman named Nora, who was 78 and had been feeding travelers since the Johnson administration, recognized Ray and refused payment with a wave that brooked no argument. She assessed Helen and Walter with the shrewd appraisal of someone who has spent 5 decades reading the stories people carry into her establishment through body language and luggage, and the particular way exhaustion sits on faces that have recently made irreversible decisions. You folks look like you're between chapters. Helen met the appraisal with equal directness. Looking for somewhere to write the next one. Nora's nod carried the authority of personal experience. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you are actually worth. The stripping away hurts like hell. But what's left afterward, that's the real you. And honey, the real you is always enough. After lunch, while Helen helped Walter back to the truck, Ray made a phone call from beside the gas pumps. His voice carried through the open window in fragments Helen did not pretend she was not cataloging. Yes, I understand it's short notice. Circumstances have changed. A pause. No, she's still declining, but I'm reconsidering the approach. Another pause longer. That's my decision to make. He returned to the truck with the expression of a man who has crossed a line he cannot recross. That was Sunny Pines. I cancelled the reservation. Walter straightened in the passenger seat. You were going to put your mother in a home. Ray corrected the tense with quiet precision. Was. I'm switching to a regional route, shorter hauls, less money, more nights in Milbrook. Moving into her house instead of moving her out of it. He pulled onto the highway before adding the rest almost to himself. Watching you two choose a bus station bench over a comfortable cage reminded me what matters. But honestly, I've been looking for an excuse to go home for years. You just gave me one I couldn't argue with. Milbrook appeared on the horizon as sunset painted the valley in amber. Church spires and the courthouse dome rose above two-story buildings lining what was clearly Main Street, the kind of American thoroughfare that exists in thousands of small towns and feels specific to each one. Street lamps flickered on as dusk gathered. The town sign read, Population 847. Though Ray noted that old Jenkins had passed in March, so the accuracy was questionable. The casual reference to knowing the census by name and obituary struck Helen as the first data point in what might become a new understanding of community, a place small enough that your absence is noted and your presence has weight. Ray delivered them to the Milbrook Inn, a ground-floor room, $38 a night, chosen with Walter's hip in mind before anyone mentioned it. Howard Jenkins, the owner, a wiry man in his 60s, greeted them with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who has room to fill and no reason to interrogate the circumstances of those filling it. The room offered exactly what it promised: 2 beds with floral spreads that predated the current century. A bathroom in avocado green, a television with physical knobs and a cleanliness that compensated for the datedness. Biscuit circled twice on the rug and collapsed with a contented sigh, apparently less troubled by their circumstances than they were. They spent the following morning transforming survival into something resembling structure. The pharmacy could transfer their prescriptions, expensive without insurance, but possible. The Milbrook Community Bank opened an account with minimal paperwork and no questions that could not be answered with vague references to retirement relocation. Howard agreed to a weekly rate that stretched their funds. Each small accomplishment deposited confidence into a reserve that had been nearly emptied. At 11 that morning, they walked to Greta's kitchen on the town square. The converted Victorian storefront held large windows overlooking a gazebo and park benches. Its interior blending nostalgic diner elements, red vinyl chrome counter-checkered floor, with touches that signaled a proprietor rather than a franchise. Local art on the walls, fresh flowers on every table. Handwritten specials that included carrot ginger bisque and meatloaf with roasted red peppers. The lunch crowd filtered in a mix of work clothes and courthouse attire, and seniors with nowhere to be and no rush to not be there. Greta Holloway arrived at their booth personally. 66 silver-streaked auburn hair in a practical bun, reading glasses on a beaded chain. A name tag that confirmed this was the owner and not the staff. Her gaze appraised them with interest rather than charity. "You must be Ray's friends," he called this morning. They ordered, they observed. Helen tracked the diner's operations with the analytical eye of someone who has run kitchens, church dinners, bake sales, and the domestic logistics of a 5-person household for decades. Greta worked nearly alone. The lunch rush exposed gaps, slow plating, delayed busing, a bakery case half empty by noon. These were not signs of negligence, but of a woman stretched beyond the capacity of a single pair of hands in a business that required at least 3. When Greta returned with their check, Helen did not wait for the offer she suspected Ray had arranged. Waiting was a form of dependence, and Helen had exhausted her tolerance for that particular posture. "I hear you lost your morning baker and your handyman in the same month." Greta's eyebrows rose, impressed rather than offended by the directness. "Ray talks too much." Helen continued without apology. "I've baked professionally for church and community events for 15 years. My husband maintained our church and community center for decades and can fix anything in a building this age. We need work and a place to stay. Show me your kitchen and I'll show you what I can do." Greta studied her for a long moment. The assessment of a woman who has run a business alone for 20 years and knows the difference between desperation and capability, and knows also that the best employees often arrive carrying both. "There's an apartment upstairs, furnished. Been empty since my son moved to Chicago." The apartment revealed itself as they climbed the narrow staircase, a living area with windows overlooking the square, a compact kitchen with newer appliances, a bedroom that fit a queen bed and a dresser. Hardwood floors maintained with the kind of care that treats buildings as living things rather than investments. Walter examined the construction with the approving eye of a craftsman recognizing quality. "Good bones, 1896. Greta watched him read the building the way she watched customers read her menu, looking for recognition rather than mere consumption. The terms took shape through honest negotiation. Helen would bake mornings starting at 5. Walter would handle building maintenance from 7. Part-time hourly, the apartment at reduced rent folded into the compensation. 1 meal per shift. Helen added her condition with the firmness of a woman who has recently learned the cost of accepting arrangements without contractual clarity. 1-month trial. Either side can end it. "I don't accept charity, Greta. This is a business arrangement." Greta's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but its first cousin. "Fair enough. 5 tomorrow morning for you, 7 for Walter." That evening, they carried their suitcases up the narrow stairs for the second time, but now as tenants rather than visitors. Greta had stocked the refrigerator with basics and left a peach cobbler on the counter with a note that read, "Simply welcome." The gesture carried warmth without obligation, sustenance without strings. A distinction Helen recognized and respected. She stood at the window as Milbrook street lamps created pools of light against the gathering dark. The town square below held a gazebo, empty benches, a war memorial she would read tomorrow. Walter eased into the armchair Greta had positioned near the radiator and watched his wife from across the small room with the particular attention of a man who has recently been reminded that watching is a privilege rather than a habit. Helen reached into her coat pocket. and produced something she had carried since Maple Avenue without mentioning it. The small ceramic pot containing the climbing rose she had dug up on their last morning in the house on the hill. Root-bound dormant, its canes trimmed to brown stubs for transport. It had traveled in her quilting bag through a midnight escape, a bus terminal, 4 hours in a pickup truck, and 2 nights in a motel. She set it on the windowsill, where morning light would find it first. First thing tomorrow, I find this thing some proper soil. Walter studied the small stubborn plant that had survived everything its owner had survived, and in roughly the same condition, stripped back, root-bound, dormant, but not dead. His hand found the armrest and gripped it once, the gesture he made when emotion threatened to exceed the container he had built for it across 75 years of practice. Neither of them said what the rose meant. Some things survive transplanting. The roots just need time to remember how to grow. The first weeks in Milbrook moved with the rhythm of bread rising slow, dependent on conditions requiring patience and the faith that invisible processes were working beneath the surface. Helen woke at 4 each morning in the apartment above Greta's kitchen, descending the narrow staircase in darkness to a commercial kitchen that smelled of yesterday's coffee and the ghost of decades of meals prepared by hands that were not hers. She learned the ovens, their hot spots, their temperaments, the way the left one ran 15 degrees high, and the right one needed a folded cardboard shim beneath the door to seal properly. She mixed dough by feel rather than recipe, adjusting hydration for humidity, kneading until the gluten developed that particular elasticity that separates competent baking from the kind that makes people drive 20 minutes out of their way for a cinnamon roll. By the end of the first week, the bakery case was full by 6:30. By the end of the second, customers who had been buying packaged muffins at the gas station were arriving before 7, following the smell of yeast and cinnamon through the morning air, like a trail laid specifically for them. Greta said nothing about the change in traffic. She did not need to. The register tape told the story in numbers that required no editorial. Walter approached the building with the reverence of a man who understood that structures built in 1896 demanded different respect than modern construction. He replaced the worn threshold strip on the front door, reglazed 3 windows, whose putty had crumbled to powder, repaired the staircase railing that had developed a dangerous wobble at the second-floor landing, and identified a slow leak in the basement that had been damaging the foundation wall for what he estimated was a decade. Each repair was a conversation between his hands and the building's history, and the building responded with the particular gratitude of old things properly maintained, settling into its corrected alignment with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like relief. Greta proved to be exactly the employer that desperation might have prevented them from hoping for. She communicated expectations, clearly acknowledged good work without excessive praise, and treated their age as a fact rather than a limitation. When Helen's arthritis slowed her kneading on cold mornings, Greta adjusted the kitchen temperature without comment. When Walter needed to sit between tasks, a stool appeared in the hallway without explanation or the suggestion that sitting constituted weakness. These accommodations arrived as naturally as weather built into the operating assumptions of a woman who had been running her body and her business on parallel tracks of determination for 20 years, and understood that endurance requires maintenance, not denial. The trial month concluded on a Tuesday afternoon. Greta closed the diner 30 minutes early and sat across from them in the booth by the window with 3 cups of coffee and the directness Helen had come to associate with her character. "You've exceeded expectations. Customers love the baking. Walter fixed things I didn't even know were broken. I'd like to make this permanent." Helen answered for both of them without consulting Walter, because certain decisions had already been made in the accumulated evidence of 4 weeks and required only verbal confirmation. "We'd like that too." As weeks became months, Milbrook absorbed them. The way small towns absorb new elements gradually with curiosity through the accumulation of small interactions that eventually constitute belonging. Helen joined the library book club, where her opinions about novels were treated as contributions rather than intrusions. She volunteered for the elementary school's after-school reading program and discovered that children who called her Grandma Helen, without being asked to fill the space she had not realized was empty until it began to close. Walter met Earl Dawson at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. 71, retired cabinet maker, owner of a workshop behind his home equipped with tools that made Walter's eyes sting with recognition. Earl had been looking for someone who understood dovetail joints and the particular satisfaction of walnut properly finished. The men bonded over technique the way other men bond over sports, with the quiet intensity of shared obsession. Earl offered access to his workshop. Walter accepted with a handshake that trembled not from weakness but from the return of something he had believed permanently confiscated. Biscuit became the diner's unofficial ambassador. Greta allowed him downstairs during slow periods where he stationed himself near the door and greeted customers with the dignified attention of an elderly gentleman who has seen everything but remains interested. When Harold Kemp, a widower whose wife had died the previous spring, sat alone at the counter for the third consecutive afternoon staring at cooling coffee, Biscuit rose without instruction and settled against Harold's leg with the warm weight of animal empathy. Harold's hand found the dog's head. His shoulders released tension they had been carrying since the funeral. Greta observed the interaction from behind the register. That dog provides more therapeutic benefit than most licensed professionals. Ray visited regularly, often bringing Ella in the passenger seat. A bright-eyed woman whose confusion arrived in unpredictable waves, sharp and present one moment adrift, the next, asking where Margaret was and why the furniture had been rearranged. Ray managed these episodes with gentle redirection that had clearly been practiced, never correcting his mother's reality, simply guiding her toward the next moment where the current one became too painful or too disorienting to sustain. He had moved into her yellow Victorian on Elm Street as promised, and the arrangement seemed to be working. Ella calmer, with her son's daily presence, Ray sleeping through nights for the first time in years, without the low-grade anxiety of distance and uncertainty. Financial stability grew by increments too small to celebrate individually, but significant in accumulation. Helen's special order baked goods, particularly the cinnamon rolls and seasonal pies, generated supplemental income. Walter's furniture restoration, beginning with a rocking chair, Earl connected him to and expanding through word of mouth, brought modest but steady commissions. They opened a savings account and made deposits that would not impress an accountant, but reduce the particular kind of insomnia that comes from knowing that a single medical emergency could eliminate every dollar standing between you and destitution. Then the floor opened beneath them. Walter's crisis arrived not through his hip, but through his blood. A Thursday morning in October, 3 months into their Milbrook life, he stood from the breakfast table, and the room tilted, not the sharp failure of a joint refusing weight, which he had already survived twice and learned to brace against, but the slow, nauseating rotation of a world losing its horizontal axis. His vision narrowed to a corridor of shrinking light. His hand reached for the counter edge and found air instead. The coffee mug shattered against the hardwood. Helen was beside him in seconds, finding him seated on the kitchen floor, conscious, but the color of wet cement, his pulse visible in the vein at his temple, hammering at a rhythm she could feel through her fingertips when she pressed them to his wrist. Biscuit circled them both, whimpering at the chemical change in his person that dogs register before any instrument built by human hands. The ambulance took 40 minutes from the county hospital. Helen rode beside Walter, holding his hand, watching the Milbrook scenery she had come to know, the square, the library, the hardware store, slide past the windows as if the town were retreating from them rather than the reverse. The emergency room doctor, young, thorough, lacking the particular condescension that some physicians deploy toward elderly patients, traced the cause to what the cheaper generic blood pressure medication had been failing to control for weeks. Walter's original prescription, the one their previous physician had calibrated over years of careful adjustment, had been replaced with an affordable substitute when they arrived in Milbrook without insurance. The generic managed adequately at first, then adequately became marginally. then marginally became dangerously. The slow accumulation of insufficiency building pressure in arteries that had been asked to perform on reduced support. The way a bridge asked to carry full traffic on half its cables will hold until the morning. It does not. The cardiologist recommended 3 months of monitored medication adjustment and cardiac evaluation, twice weekly appointments to recalibrate what should never have been changed without supervision. Without insurance, the estimated cost settled between them on the hospital table like a verdict $3,200. Their savings account held $940. Helen sat in the hospital corridor while Walter slept under sedation and performed the arithmetic that had become the defining exercise of her 7th decade. 940 against 3,200 left a deficit of $2,260, a number that might as well have been 22 million for all the mechanisms available to close the gap. She could increase her baking hours. Walter could not work during recovery. Their income would drop while their expenses doubled. The math did not solve. She stared at the vending machine across the hall and felt for the first time since the night she overheard Vanessa's plan the structural integrity of her determination beginning to fracture along lines she had not known existed. The second blow arrived 3 days later, forwarded through the Postal Service's change of address system with the impersonal efficiency of bureaucracy. A legal envelope. Return address, the law offices of Garrett and Associates. Inside, a formal notification of guardianship proceedings initiated on behalf of Vanessa Whitmore, requesting a competency evaluation of Helen and Walter Whitmore, requiring their appearance before the county court within 60 days. Helen read the document twice standing at the apartment's kitchen counter, while October rain streaked the windows. Vanessa had not stopped. The escape, the distance, the months of demonstrated independence, none of it had interrupted the machinery that had been set in motion that night through the heating vent. The gears still turned. The hearing was still coming. And now, with Walter unable to work and their savings insufficient and their lives balanced on the narrow foundation of a diner apartment and community goodwill, the evidence Vanessa needed to prove their incompetence was assembling itself without her assistance. At 4 in the morning, the day after the letter arrived, Helen descended to the diner kitchen for her shift. Walter was at the county hospital for his first overnight observation. The apartment was empty in a way it had not been since their arrival, not just unoccupied, but evacuated the particular silence of a space from which a familiar presence has been subtracted. She turned on the kitchen lights. She laid out flour, butter, yeast, sugar. She measured ingredients into the industrial mixer with movements so practiced they required no conscious direction. And then she stopped. Her hands, dusted white to the wrists, rested on the stainless steel counter. Her shoulders, which had carried 5 months of rebuilding, and 6 months before that of systematic diminishment, and 48 years before that of motherhood and marriage, and the ordinary weight of being the person in a family who holds things together, released their tension all at once, not gradually, but completely, like a rope cut rather than unwound. Helen Whitmore cried in the kitchen of Greta's diner at 4:17 in the morning, with her hands in flour and the overhead lights buzzing their fluorescent hymn to endurance. She cried not from fear, which she had managed, or exhaustion, which she had accommodated, but from fury, the specific clarifying rage of a woman who has done everything right and been punished for it by a system that rewards the people with lawyers over the people with integrity. She had sold her home. She had saved her son's family. She had walked 6 blocks at midnight with a man who could barely stand. She had built a new life from $1,160 and the willingness to wake before dawn. And Vanessa, from the comfort of a house that Helen's sacrifice had preserved, was reaching across state lines to drag her into a courtroom and declare her unfit to manage the life she had just proven she could rebuild from nothing. Greta found her there. The older woman, though at 66, she was 6 years Helen's junior. A fact that neither of them found relevant, descended the stairs in a bathrobe drawn by the absence of the sounds that should have been filling the kitchen by now. She took in the scene without visible reaction. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not offer comfort. She walked to the coffee maker, brewed a pot, poured 2 cups, set one in front of Helen, and sat down across from her at the prep table. She waited. Greta Holloway understood that certain silences are not empty, but full, and interrupting them is not kindness but theft. Helen told her everything. Not the edited version she had offered to explain their arrival, downsizing, relocation, vague references to family complications, but the complete architecture of betrayal: the house sold, the son's weakness, the daughter-in-law's plan, the midnight escape, the letter now sitting on her kitchen table with its 60-day countdown. The words came in order without self-pity, the way a contractor describes structural damage accurately, completely, with professional detachment that does not conceal the severity. Greta listened to the end. Then she refilled both cups and spoke with the particular authority of a woman offering testimony rather than advice. My late husband tried to put me in a facility once. Said I was unstable after our son moved away. Emotional episodes, he called it, meaning I cried when my boy left and didn't stop for a month. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Know what I did? I hired a lawyer meaner than he was. And I learned something important: the law protects you if you know where to look. But you have to look. Helen looked. The Milbrook Public Library's legal reference section occupied a single shelf. But that shelf contained the state's annotated code on guardianship proceedings. She read for 3 hours the following afternoon while Walter napped at the hospital. The statute required an independent medical evaluation, not merely the assessment of a family physician who had been briefed by the petitioner, but an examination by a court-appointed professional with no prior relationship to either party. The burden of proof rested on the petitioner. The respondent had the right to legal representation, to present evidence of capability, to call witnesses who could testify to their functional independence. Greta connected her with Thomas Bridges, 74, retired from a 30-year law practice that had included, among other specialties, elder law. Tom Bridges still maintained a desk in a converted bedroom of his farmhouse 3 miles outside town, surrounded by case files he could not bring himself to recycle, and law books he consulted more from habit than necessity. He reviewed the guardianship petition over reading glasses and a cup of Helen's coffee, asking questions with the economical precision of a man who charged by the hour for 40 years and never lost the habit. His assessment arrived in plain language. The petition relies on medical documentation from a physician who was consulting with the petitioner, not the respondents. That's procedurally questionable. Your current circumstances: steady employment, independent housing, community integration demonstrated. Financial management constitutes strong evidence of capacity. I'll file a formal objection request and independent evaluation and submit affidavits from your employer, your physician here, and community members attesting to your daily functioning. He paused, removing his glasses to clean them, the gesture of a man choosing his next words with care. You should also know that pursuing guardianship under these circumstances, where the petitioner stands to gain financially and the respondents have demonstrated capacity, can itself be characterized as a form of elder abuse. That cuts both ways in a courtroom. Helen authorized the filing. Tom Bridges charged nothing, declining payment with the stubbornness of a man who had retired specifically to do the work that mattered without the work that paid for it. Helen insisted on a written agreement acknowledging his services and her intent to compensate when able. Charity remained a currency she would not accept even from allies. The legal defense had form. The medical crisis still lacked funding. Helen spread the hospital estimates across the kitchen table one evening, after closing 3,200, against 940, a deficit that arithmetic could identify but not close. She had begun calculating which baking shifts she could extend, which meals she could skip without Walter noticing the portion shrinking, when Greta sat down across from her uninvited and slid a check across the formica. Before you say no, this is a loan, not a gift. I'm advancing it against the revenue your cinnamon rolls have generated in 3 months, which I can document to the penny if your pride requires an invoice. Greta's tone carried the finality of a woman who has anticipated every objection and pre-demolished each one. Repayment through payroll deduction over 12 months. I've drawn up terms, sign or don't, but the cardiac appointments start Monday because I need my handyman back on two steady legs. And I need my baker not distracted by worry at 4 in the morning when she should be thinking about dough. Helen read the single-page agreement. Interest-free. 12 monthly deductions, clear language, no ambiguity, no charity wearing a business costume. An actual business decision made by a woman who understood that dignity and assistance occupy the same room only when the paperwork is honest. Helen signed, "Thank you, Greta." The older woman was already stacking coffee cups. "Thank me by telling Walter to fix the wobble in booth 4 when he's back on his feet. He knows which screw." Walter's cardiac appointments began the following week. Ray drove him to the county hospital on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a round trip of 80 minutes that Ray performed without complaint and without accepting gas money. Though Helen left envelopes in his truck that he pretended not to find, and she pretended not to replace. In exchange, Helen spent Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with Ella at the Yellow Victorian on Elm Street, keeping the older woman company, redirecting confusion with patience, learned from years of practice with children who also inhabit worlds that do not always align with adult reality. The arrangement operated on reciprocity rather than charity services exchanged between people who needed different things at the same time. Walter's recovery proceeded in the small increments that cardiac rehabilitation demands. Gains measured in stabilized readings and reduced medication dosages rather than dramatic transformation. The cardiologist, a pragmatic woman named Carol, who treated her elderly patients with the same expectations she applied to her younger ones, recalibrated Walter's medications through careful titration until the numbers held steady. Helen accompanied him to the final evaluation in early December, standing in the doorway of the exam room while Carol reviewed the charts. Walter stood from the chair without assistance. He walked across the room with steady gait. His blood pressure, read twice to confirm, fell within normal range for the first time since they had left Oak Ridge Estates. Helen watched from the door. She did not applaud. She did not cry. She offered a single nod, the acknowledgement of a woman who has witnessed her husband reclaim something that should never have been taken from him. Walter's eyes found hers across the room, and in that exchange passed everything that words would have diminished. But the legal letter was still on the kitchen table. The hearing date was still approaching. One crisis had resolved. The other remained. In late October, once the legal filing was underway, and Walter's cardiac appointments had established a rhythm that no longer required her presence at every session, Helen did something she had been building towards since the night she overheard the plan through the heating vent. She purchased a prepaid phone from the Milbrook pharmacy, untraceable to Mitchell's family plan, unconnected to any account Vanessa could monitor, and dialed a number she had memorized years ago and never deleted from the permanent storage of maternal memory. The phone rang 5 times across the distance between a small town in the Eastern Hills and a military housing complex in Honolulu. Claire answered with the cautious hello of someone receiving an unfamiliar number. "It's Mom." The silence that followed was not empty but overflowing. Years of unanswered emails, unreturned letters, birthday packages sent to grandchildren who never acknowledged them, filling the connection between the mainland and the islands with accumulated confusion and hurt. Claire's voice, when it returned, carried the fracture lines of someone who has been holding a question for years without anyone to ask it to. "Mom, we thought you didn't want to hear from us anymore. I've been writing, sending gifts for the kids. Nothing ever came back, not even a note." Helen closed her eyes. "I never received any of it, sweetheart. Not one letter, not one package." Silence expanded across the connection between the mainland and the islands, filling with the weight of 3 years rewritten in a single exchange. Claire's breath caught the sound of a woman recalculating an entire narrative she had believed about herself, about her family, about the reasons love sometimes goes unanswered. "Someone stopped it from reaching you." Claire did not frame it as a question. Helen did not yet have the full architecture of the answer. She knew what had not arrived, but not yet whose hands had diverted it, though the shape of the absence was too precise, too complete to be accidental. Mothers and daughters do not lose each other through carelessness alone. I don't know everything yet, but I know it wasn't you and it wasn't us. That's enough for now. Claire's husband's military contract ended in 8 months. They had been discussing a return to the mainland. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and cost $4 and changed the geometry of a family that had been fractured along lines no one had drawn voluntarily. The week before Thanksgiving, Milbrook received its first significant snowfall. Helen was carrying a fresh pecan pie from the kitchen to the display case. When the front door opened and admitted a figure that stopped her between one step and the next, the pie balanced in her hands like an offering suspended between past and present. Mitchell Whitmore stood in the doorway of Greta's kitchen, snow melting on his shoulders, his face carrying new lines around the eyes, and a heaviness in his posture that 6 months should not have been able to produce but apparently had. Walter, entering through the side door from a maintenance task, stopped with his hand on the frame. For several seconds, the diner held its breath, the ambient sounds of coffee and radio and winter wind outside receding as if the building itself understood that what was about to happen required acoustic space. Greta read the geometry of the moment with the intuition of a woman who has witnessed thousands of human interactions across her counter. She moved through the remaining customers with quiet efficiency. "Folks, private matter. Let me cash you out with a weather discount." The diner emptied within minutes, leaving only Greta, who retreated to the kitchen with a nod toward Helen that communicated support without intrusion. Mitchell removed his coat with the slow deliberation of a man who understands that sudden movements in the presence of people he has hurt might be interpreted as aggression rather than eagerness. He looked older. He looked diminished. He looked like a man who has recently discovered that the scaffolding supporting his life was constructed from materials that could not bear the weight he had placed on them. "Hello, Mom. Dad." The greeting carried relief and apprehension in equal concentration, a solution that could precipitate in either direction depending on the temperature of the response. "It took a while to find you." Walter found his voice before Helen, whose silence was not absence but assessment. "How?" The answer traced a path from desperation through professional investigation to the particular networks that connect veterans across geography. Private investigator, then veteran contacts. Someone remembered Ray helping an elderly couple with a golden retriever. Helen remained motionless, pie still balanced, mind-running calculations more complex than any balance sheet. Had Vanessa sent him? Was this retrieval disguised as reunion? Mitchell addressed the unspoken question with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment across 4 hours of highway driving. "I'm alone. Vanessa doesn't know I'm here." The name released something in the room's atmosphere, a slight easing of the pressure that had been building since the door opened. Helen set the pie on the nearest table with careful hands and gestured toward a booth away from the windows. The maternal reflex that reached for the coffee pot surprised her with its persistence. Some circuits do not disconnect regardless of damage to the larger system. Mitchell sat across from them and delivered the accounting of the months since their departure, with the thoroughness of a man who has prepared his testimony and understands that omission would be more damaging than the truth. After they left, Vanessa had been furious, not concerned. Her plans derailed her timeline, disrupted her control over the narrative, compromised. She had told the children that their grandparents left because they no longer loved them. Lily, with the devastating clarity she had always possessed, rejected the explanation on its face. "Grandma would never stop loving me. Something bad must have happened." Mitchell had begun searching immediately, telling Vanessa it was to reassure the children. Telling himself the same, knowing in the private courtroom of his conscience that it was penance rather than reassurance. And as he searched, he also began examining pulling threads that Vanessa had woven so tightly into the fabric of their marriage that he had stopped noticing they were there. Financial decisions made without consultation. Social connections systematically pruned. His parents' decline documented with the enthusiasm of someone building a case rather than expressing concern. The discovery that broke the architecture entirely came in September. Mitchell found a drawer in Vanessa's home office that contained 18 months of intercepted mail, letters from Claire in Honolulu, birthday cards addressed to Lily and Oliver with Hawaiian postmarks, a handwritten note from Claire to Helen that began, "I don't understand why you've stopped writing back," and ended with, "Please, Mom, just tell me what I did wrong." Vanessa had not merely neglected to forward the correspondence. She had collected it, organized it chronologically, and stored it with the same methodical precision she had applied to documenting Helen's supposed cognitive decline. Mitchell confronted her that evening. Vanessa did not deny the interception. She characterized it as practical family management protecting household stability from Claire's negative influence and emotional volatility. Mitchell heard the words and recognized with the sickening clarity of a man waking inside a building he has just realized is on fire, that the woman explaining her actions used the same tone and the same logic for every act of control she had ever exercised. Reasonable, measured, unassailable in its internal consistency, and fundamentally cruel in its effect on every person it touched. They separated in September. Shared custody. The children were with Mitchell, now staying at the Milbrook Motel with a neighbor who had traveled with them, while Mitchell located the diner. Helen had listened to the entire account without speaking. The silence was not forgiveness, it was not punishment. It was the space required to process the distance between the son she had raised and the man who had allowed his parents to be driven from their home by a woman whose ambition operated without the inconvenience of empathy. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, which would have been easier for Mitchell to absorb, but something worse, the flat precision of a woman stating facts that cannot be argued with, because they are simply true. You heard her plan to strip us of our rights. You heard her discuss our finances like inventory, and your strongest objection was about bedtime stories. Mitchell did not deflect. You're right, I failed you. The admission arrived without qualification, without explanation, without the cushioning that weaker men wrap around their confessions to soften the impact on themselves. I was afraid of losing my marriage, my home, the children's stability, and I chose those fears over you. Every day for 5 months I made that choice, and every day I knew it was wrong, and every day I made it again because cowardice is easier when you practice it daily. Helen held his gaze for a long moment. Walter's hand moved across the table and covered his son's, a gesture of connection that did not require Helen's participation or approval. She noted it without resentment. Walter's forgiveness operated on a different timeline than hers, and she did not begrudge him the difference. Now tell me about the children. Mitchell brought them within the hour. Lily came through the door first, 6 years old, now taller, her dark braids catching snowflakes that melted into tiny stars against the dark hair. She spotted Helen across the diner, and the intervening space ceased to exist. She crossed it at a velocity that physics should not have permitted, a child of her size colliding with her grandmother's body, with an impact that released something in Helen's chest that had been locked since the night she kissed a sleeping forehead through the darkness and walked away. You came back. The whisper arrived against Helen's neck, muffled by the embrace, carrying the desperate relief of a child who has been told a lie about abandonment and refused to believe it. Helen held her granddaughter and breathed in the smell of children's shampoo and winter cold, and the particular scent that belongs only to people you have loved since before they could speak. She corrected gently, because precision matters even in moments of overwhelming emotion, perhaps especially then. No, sweetheart, I didn't come back. I went forward, and now you're here with me. Oliver followed 5, now clutching the carved cardinal in one mittened hand, with the protective grip of a child who has assigned an object the full weight of a relationship. His eyes held the solemn intensity of a boy managing emotions larger than his vocabulary. Walter knelt despite the formal objection of his rehabilitated body opening arms that had been empty of grandchildren for 6 months. Is that my bird? Oliver nodded with the gravity of a swan's statement. I kept him safe. He sleeps by my bed so I don't forget you. Walter gathered the boy into the kind of embrace that does not require response because it is its own complete communication. I missed you every single day. Biscuit rose from his corner with the arthritic determination of an old dog recognizing familiar scent, his tail sweeping slow arcs of confirmation. The children transferred their joy to him with the fluid emotional transitions that only the very young can execute, and the diner filled with the sound of children's voices and a dog's patient acceptance and the quiet breathing of adults who are watching something heal that they were not certain could. Arrangements took shape through the afternoon and into evening. Mitchell would stay through Thanksgiving in a rented cabin. He had brought boxes rescued from storage photo albums, Walter's specialized woodworking tools, Helen's recipe collection items he had preserved against the possibility of exactly this moment. Future visits would be monthly with longer stays during school holidays. Helen established the boundary with clarity that permitted no ambiguity. The children come here. We don't go back to that house. Mitchell accepted without argument. The guardianship petition Tom Bridges had filed the objection. Mitchell confirmed he would testify against Vanessa's claims if the case proceeded to hearing. With Mitchell's testimony, Helen and Walters demonstrated independence and the procedural irregularities in the original filing. The case would almost certainly be dismissed. Claire had spoken with Mitchell. Her husband's contract ended in June. They were looking at the mainland, possibly somewhere within driving distance of Milbrook. The fractured family was not reassembling into its original shape, which had contained fault lines invisible until pressure revealed them, but into a new configuration that acknowledged damage honestly and built around it rather than over it. Helen addressed her son for the last time that afternoon, with words she had chosen carefully, because careless language in moments of reconciliation can create obligations that resentment later converts into weapons. Forgiveness takes time, Mitchell. I'm not there yet, but the door isn't closed. The Thanksgiving table at Greta's kitchen extended across the diner's main floor, assembled from smaller tables pushed together and covered with mismatched cloths that Greta had collected over decades. Greta cooked the main course. Helen's pies occupied the counter pecan apple pumpkin, 3 variations on the theme of sweetness earned through labor. Ray arrived with Ella, who smiled at everyone with the generalized warmth of a woman for whom specific identities had become less important than the feeling of being surrounded by people who wished her well. Earl Dawson brought a wooden train he had carved for Oliver, its wheels turning smoothly on axles that represented 60 years of a craftsman's accumulated knowledge applied to a child's delight. Lily stood beside Helen at the counter, learning to crimp eye edges with the focused concentration of a girl who understands that some skills are inherited not through genes, but through proximity and patience. Oliver sat next to Walter, the cardinal position between their plates, like a small wooden mediator between past and present. Ray surveyed the assembled company with the particular expression of a man who has spent too many holidays in truck stops and diners populated by strangers. When you Whitmores do family complications, you certainly commit to the production. The comment arrived dry and precisely timed, cutting the residual tension with the efficiency of someone who understands that laughter and gravity can coexist at the same table. Earl offered the perspective of his craft, studying the group the way he studied wood before cutting. Good restoration always starts with an honest damage assessment. Then you rebuild with stronger joints than before. After dinner, as the evening settled into the comfortable exhaustion of children, fed past their usual limits and adults processing emotions that had been accumulating for months, Mitchell departed with Lily and Oliver toward their cabin. Lily clung to Helen at the door. "You won't disappear again." Helen knelt to meet her granddaughter's eyes at their own level, because promises made to children deserve the posture of equals. "Grandpa and I live here now, upstairs right above this kitchen. You can visit us and we will always answer when you call." Oliver joined his sister for the collective confirmation. "Promise." Helen placed one hand on each child's shoulder. "We promise, and Whitmores keep their promises." The words settled between the three of them with the weight of covenant, not the legal kind that Vanessa had attempted to weaponize, but the original kind, the one that predates courtrooms and lawyers, and exists only in the space between people who mean what they say. Their friends departed into the snowy evening. Ray with Ella on his arm navigating the icy sidewalk with the attentive care of a son who has chosen presence over convenience. Earl with sawdust still in his cuffs, and the contentment of a man who has found late in life someone who speaks his language of wood and patience. Greta last to leave the kitchen, pausing at the stairs with a dish towel over her shoulder, and an expression that Helen had learned to read as the particular satisfaction of a woman whose table has served its highest purpose. Helen and Walter climbed the stairs to their apartment, Biscuit following with the slow determination of an elderly dog ascending familiar territory. The living room received them with the warmth of the radiator and the small accumulations of months of habitation, the reading lamp. Walter had repaired the blue throw pillows Helen had found at a church rummage sale, the radio that kept her company during pre-dawn baking hours. On the windowsill, the climbing rose from Maple Avenue had produced 2 new leaves since being transplanted into proper soil. Small pale green, improbable proof that dormancy is not death, and that roots given time and honest ground remember what they were made to do. Walter settled into his chair. Helen made tea. The ritual required no discussion, no negotiation, no permission from anyone whose authority over their daily lives had been established by law or manipulation rather than love. The kettle boiled, the cups filled, steam rose between them like a visible breath. Not the retirement we planned. Helen set down her tea. Through the window, the town that had received them when they arrived with nothing but suitcases and a dog, and the stubborn refusal to be diminished, slept in the particular piece of a place that knows exactly what it is and does not apologize for not being larger or louder or more important. No, better. Biscuit sighed from his place beside the radiator. The sound of an animal who has located his people and his warmth and requires nothing else from the universe. The November wind moved through bare branches outside the window, carrying snow sideways through lamplight, rearranging the surface of things, while leaving the foundations undisturbed, like the town below, like the family reconfiguring itself around honesty rather than obligation. Like 2 people who had discovered at an age when most discoveries are behind you that the most durable version of home is the one you build after the first one burns down, not because it is grander, but because you know this time exactly what it costs and exactly what it's worth.